At 58, after 34 years of building a life that was not her own, Eliza found herself erased. She had lost the house with the climbing roses she had babied for 2 decades, the friends who evaporated like morning fog when the money left, and the man who had promised forever only to rewrite the contract in the final act. Her husband, Richard, a man who built shining towers of glass and steel on the bones of other people's histories, had taken everything. And in a final, theatrical flourish of cruelty, he had left her with one thing. A single, worthless piece of land on the forgotten edge of town, the deed to her father's derelict drive-in theater, a place so broken it was a monument to failure. He had insisted on it in the settlement, the transfer recorded for $1, a price chosen not for its value, but for its weight as an insult. The lawyers had smirked. Her children, his children really, polished and ambitious and ashamed, had called her, their voices tight with embarrassment. "Don't make a scene, Mother. Just sign it. Let it go." The town, the one that courted Richard's favor and celebrated his name on plaques, laughed a quiet, pitying laugh. Poor Eliza. What will she do with that old junkyard? But what nobody knew, what Richard in his polished arrogance could never comprehend, was that inside the peeling paint and shattered glass of the locked projection booth, her father, Arthur, had left behind more than just dust and decay. He had not left a fortune. He had left a record. He had left a reason. That, though, comes later. First, there was the silence. The profound, ringing silence of a life hollowed out. After the last box was moved from the house she was no longer allowed to call home. After the last, condescending glance from the moving men Richard had hired, she found herself in a small, beige apartment that smelled of stale paint and other people's transient sorrows. The furniture was rented. The plates were cheap ceramic that felt dead in her hands. For 34 years, her days had been a symphony of small, important tasks. The schedules of the children, the planning of the dinners, the cultivation of the relationships that greased the wheels of Richard's relentless climb. Now, there was nothing. The silence in the apartment was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered sound and thought. It was the silence of a future she had never planned for, a blank page she had no idea how to fill. Her reflection in the dark window was a stranger, a woman with faint lines around her eyes that weren't from laughter, a woman who had made herself small for so long she wasn't sure how to take up space anymore. The memory of the final meeting in the lawyer's office played on a loop. The room was a fishbowl of mahogany and leather, smelling of power and paper. Richard sat opposite her, his suit immaculate, his face a mask of serene, reasonable concern. His lawyer, a young man with hungry eyes named Mark, shuffled papers, avoiding her gaze. Her own lawyer, paid for by a dwindling fund Richard had magnanimously provided, had already surrendered. "This is the best deal you're going to get, Eliza." He had said it in the hallway, his voice weary. "He's got all the cards." Richard had spoken, his voice the same smooth baritone he used to charm city councils. "It's about being fair, Eliza. We both know the drive-in has been an eyesore for years. It's technically a liability. But it was your father's. It felt right that you should have it. A piece of your family." He slid the deed across the vast polished table. The single sheet of paper felt heavier than a tombstone. $1. The consideration was listed as $1. It was a joke he was telling to an audience only he could see. He was giving her a ruin, a piece of land he knew was worthless in its current state, but which sat adjacent to a parcel he was already assembling for his next grand project. He was giving her a cage and waiting for her to starve, so he could come back and buy the bars for scrap. She had signed. Her hand had been steady. She had not looked at him. She had looked at the young lawyer, Mark, who had flinched, a small, almost imperceptible tightening in his jaw, before his face went blank again. He knew. He knew the shape of the cruelty. The drive-in. She hadn't thought of it in years. Not really. It existed in her mind as a sepia-toned memory from childhood. a place of gravelly sounds and giant flickering ghosts on a vast white screen under a blanket of stars. Her father, Arthur, a quiet man with calloused hands and a gentle smile, had loved it with a fierce, impractical passion. He kept it running long after the world had moved on to multiplexes, patching the screen, tinkering with the ancient projectors, a lonely captain on a sinking ship. The town saw him as a fool, a sentimentalist clinging to the past. Richard had called him the same, many times, over dinner tables where the wine cost more than the drive-in made in a month. Now it was hers. The joke was on her. A 58-year-old woman with no job, no savings, and a degree in art history from 1982 was the proud owner of a dead drive-in. The silence in the apartment was broken by a sound, a dry, rasping sob that she didn't recognize as her own until she felt the dampness on her hands. She did not cry for the house, or the money, or the man. She cried for the sheer, suffocating waste of it all. The years, folded and packed away like linens, a trousseau for a marriage that had been a mirage. She cried until she was empty, and in that emptiness, a new thought, small and hard as a seed, began to form. What if she went there? Not to sell it, not to weep over it, just to see it, just to stand on the one piece of ground left in the world that was, however nominally, hers. The thought was absurd. It was pointless, and it was the only thing that made sense. The next morning, she put the key to her old car, a sputtering sedan Richard had deemed too old to be seen in, into the ignition. In the glove box, amongst old receipts and dried-out pens, her fingers closed around a heavy, metal object. A drive-in speaker, its cord coiled neatly. She'd taken it from the pole on the last night her father had ever run a movie, a piece of useless, sentimental junk. She had kept it for 30 years. She left the beige apartment, leaving the silence behind, and drove toward the edge of town, toward the ruin that bore her father's name, and now, hers. The town remembered Arthur, Eliza's father, in the way that small towns remember their eccentrics, with a mixture of affection and dismissal. He was a fixture, like the old water tower or the cracked pavement on Main Street. A good man, they'd say at the hardware store or the diner. A bit of a dreamer. Never had much of a head for business. Their memories were snapshots, faded and incomplete. They remembered him letting kids in for free if they helped pick up stray popcorn boxes. They remembered him under the hood of a stranger's stalled car in the lot, his hands covered in grease, waving off thanks. He'd just nod and say, "Can't watch the show if you can't get home." Sam, who ran the town's only real diner, the kind of place with cracked red vinyl booths and a counter worn smooth by the elbows of generations, remembered more. Sam was a man carved from the same quiet, sturdy wood as Arthur. He saw Eliza's old car pull up one morning, a week after she'd arrived back in town, and before she could even slide into a booth, he'd set a cup of coffee and a plate of eggs in front of her. He didn't ask if she was hungry. He knew. "Your father," he said, wiping the counter with a clean rag, his back mostly to her, "was not a fool." Eliza, who had been staring into her coffee cup as if it held the secrets of the universe, looked up. "The whole town thought he was," she said, her voice raspy. "The town thinks a man's worth is the size of his bank account," Sam said, turning to face her, his eyes clear and direct. "Your father knew better. He knew worth and price are two different things." He told her about the winter of '98, when the old mill closed down and half the town was out of work. The drive-in had no business being open in December. The cold was too bitter. But Arthur had fired up the projectors anyway. He showed old cartoons, flickering and scratched, their sound tinny through the metal speakers. He'd set up a bonfire in a steel drum near the concession stand and served hot soup that his wife, Eliza's mother, had made in a giant pot. He never charged a soul that winter. He said people needed a place to go, Sam recalled, his voice low. A place to be together, even in the dark, especially in the dark. He paused, looking out the diner window toward the edge of town, where the drive-in's skeletal screen was just visible against the sky. He used to say that. The dark is where you see the light best. Eliza felt a tremor go through her, a memory unlocked by the phrase. Her father, standing by the humming projectors in the warm, cramped booth, the smell of hot metal and ozone in the air. He had said that to her once, when she was a little girl, afraid of the monsters she was sure lived in the shadows beyond the reach of the movie's light. The dark is where you see the light best, Lizzie. It just shows you where to look. She had forgotten. Richard's world had been one of bright, halogen-lit boardrooms and sun-drenched patios. A world where darkness was something to be eliminated, paved over, developed out of existence. He had despised the drive-in, not just for its lack of profitability, but for its very nature. It was old, it was slow, it was communal in a way he couldn't control or monetize. During their early years of marriage, he'd tried to convince Arthur to sell the land. "Think of the equity, Arthur," he'd say, his voice dripping with a condescending reasonableness that Eliza now recognized as his primary weapon. "You're sitting on a gold mine. We could put in a beautiful retail center, a legacy." Arthur would just shake his head, wiping his hands on an oily rag. "It's already a beautiful center, Richard, and I've got all the legacy I need right here." Richard would laugh, a short, sharp sound of disbelief, and look at Eliza as if to say, "See? See what I have to put up with." And she, young and in love and eager to please, had been embarrassed by her father's stubbornness, his refusal to see the logic of it. She had sided with the light, not realizing it was a sterile, artificial glare. The full measure of Richard's cruelty, she was beginning to understand, was not just in what he had taken from her, but in what he had made her forget. He hadn't just taken her future, he had tried to steal her past, rewriting it as a sad story of sentimental failure she needed to be rescued from. The drive-in was the last piece of that past, the one piece he hadn't managed to bulldoze. He thought he was giving her a pile of trash, a final humiliation. But sitting there in Sam's diner, the taste of coffee and regret on her tongue, Eliza started to suspect he had made a terrible mistake. He had given her the one thing he couldn't understand. He had given her a key. Sam refilled her coffee cup. "He was proud of you, you know," he said quietly. Eliza flinched. "Proud of me? For what? Marrying a rich man? Forgetting where I came from?" "No," Sam said, his gaze unwavering. "He was just proud you were his daughter. He never stopped being proud of that, even when you stopped coming around." The words landed like stones, heavy and true. She paid for her breakfast with the last of her cash, her hands shaking slightly. As she left, Sam called after her. "Eliza, that land, it's not just dirt and gravel, it's a place. Places have memory. Don't let him take that too." She drove back to the drive-in, not to the beige apartment. She parked the car just inside the rusted gate and got out, the crunch of the gravel under her feet the only sound. The wind whispered through the tall weeds that grew in the cracks of the asphalt. The giant screen, its white paint peeling to reveal the wood beneath like exposed bone, stood against the gray sky like a silent sentinel. It didn't look like a ruin anymore. It looked like a question. The first days took on a shape dictated by the sun and the limits of her own body. Eliza worked from dawn until her muscles screamed in protest, a language they hadn't spoken in decades. She started with the weeds. Armed with a rusty scythe she'd found in the shed and a pair of her mother's old gardening gloves, she waded into the sea of green that had swallowed the parking lot. Each swing of the blade was a small act of reclamation. With every patch of cracked asphalt she uncovered, she felt a sliver of herself returning. The physical labor was a balm. It left no room for the looping thoughts of what she'd lost. There was only the pull in her shoulders, the sweat on her brow, the satisfying rip of roots from the earth. The town watched. Cars slowed as they passed, the drivers' faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. There's the developer's ex-wife, playing farmer in that old dump. She bought supplies at the hardware store, cheap bags of concrete mix, and a new lock for the main gate. The clerk, A young man who couldn't have been more than 20 looked at her with wide, uncomprehending eyes, as if she were a ghost from a bygone era. She ignored the stares. She was rediscovering her hands. They had been ornamental for so long, their most strenuous task lifting a wine glass or cutting a ribbon at a charity event. Now they were rediscovering their purpose. They learned the heft of a hammer, the grit of sand and cement, the sharp bite of a stubborn nail. She patched the potholes in the asphalt, one by one, mixing the concrete in a wheelbarrow, her movements slow and clumsy at first, then gaining a rhythm. It was on the third day that she met the dog. He was a creature of the drive-in, as much a part of the landscape as the rusted speaker poles. A scruffy, grizzled terrier mix with one cloudy eye and fur the color of dust. He emerged from under the shadow of the ticket booth as she approached, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He didn't bark. He just stood his ground, a silent, furry guardian. "Hey there," Eliza said softly, holding out a hand. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you." The dog watched her, unmoving. She recognized him then, a flicker of memory from her last visits when her father was still alive. Arthur had called him Flicker, after the unsteady light of the old projectors. He'd been a stray who had wandered in one night and never left. He was her father's dog. She spent the next hour sitting on the ground a few feet away from the ticket booth, talking to him in a low, calm voice, telling him about her day, about the weeds and the concrete. Finally, she took out the sandwich Sam had pressed into her hand that morning and tore off a piece, tossing it gently onto the ground between them. Flicker watched it fall, then looked back at her, his one good eye appraising her. After a long moment, he crept forward, snatched the bread, and retreated to his post. It was a start. Her arrival at the place had been an act of desperation. Now it was becoming an act of devotion. Each small repair was a prayer. She cleared the debris from the concession stand, a time capsule of decay. Rotted cardboard boxes, shattered soda bottles, the mummified remains of ancient popcorn. The air was thick with the smell of mouse droppings and stale sugar. Behind the counter, she found a single, startling object of order amidst the chaos. A row of empty glass jars, washed and neatly lined up on a shelf, as if waiting to be filled. It was a detail so at odds with the surrounding neglect that it made her pause. Her father had been a tidy man in his workshop, but this was different. This was deliberate. Later that week, as she was wrestling a tangle of thorny vines from the base of the giant screen, Sam's old truck rattled up the gravel lane. He got out, carrying a thermos and a paper bag. "Thought you could use this," he said, handing it to her. Inside were 2 thick roast beef sandwiches and an apple. They sat on the tailgate of his truck, the grizzled dog, Flicker, now a constant shadow at Eliza's heels, sitting patiently at her feet. "Richard's buying up the old Miller farm," Sam said, not looking at her. "The one just north of here. Plans for a gated community. Lakeside Estates, he's calling it. There's no lake." Eliza felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. That was the adjacent parcel, the final piece of his puzzle. "He'll be coming for this land next," she said. It wasn't a question. "He thinks he already has it," Sam corrected her gently. "He thinks you're just keeping it warm for him." He took a long swallow from the thermos. "Your father, he fought them off for years. Offers from developers, zoning board notices, complaints from the neighbors. He just absorbed it all. Never told anyone how much pressure he was under." He looked over at the peeling screen. He believed this place was important, more important than money. After Sam left, Eliza stood for a long time, looking at the drive-in not as a burden, but as a battlefield. A place that had been defended. A legacy of resistance she hadn't even known existed. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the newly cleared lot, she turned her attention to the projection booth. It sat atop the concession stand like a watchtower, its windows dark and inscrutable. The metal stairs leading up to it were rusted, but solid. At the top, a heavy steel door blocked her way. A modern, high-security lock was fastened to it, a stark contrast to the decay around it. It was not her father's lock. This was new, and as she examined it, she saw something else. The hinges. Unlike every other piece of metal at the drive-in, which was streaked with rust and pitted with age, the hinges on this door were clean, oiled. Someone had been maintaining this door. Flicker, who had followed her up the stairs, began to whine, a low, insistent sound. He pawed at the base of the door, his claws making a scratching sound against the metal. He knew what was inside. He was trying to tell her. Eliza ran her hand over the cool, smooth surface of the lock. It was a message. A barrier, yes, but also a sign. This was the place. This was where the answers were. The heart of the mystery. And it was locked against her. Getting into the projection booth became an obsession. The lock was a professional-grade deadbolt, immune to the rusty collection of keys her father had left hanging on a nail in the shed. She couldn't afford a locksmith, and even if she could, the act of hiring one felt like a betrayal of the puzzle. This was a secret meant to be unraveled, not battered into submission. For 2 days, she tried everything she could think of. She searched for a hidden key, tapping bricks and checking under loose floorboards. She studied the window frames, but they were sealed tight. All the while, Flicker would sit at the bottom of the metal stairs, his one good eye fixed on the door, occasionally letting out a low, mournful whine, a constant, furry reminder of her failure. The anomaly of the door, its pristine hinges and modern lock, gnawed at her. It didn't fit the narrative of decay. It spoke of purpose, of something inside that was valuable enough to protect long after the rest of the drive-in had been left to the elements. On the third day, defeated, she decided to tackle the concession stand again. There was a section of the back wall, behind where the big popcorn machine must have stood, that felt wrong. The rest of the building was cinder block, but this one 10-foot stretch was drywall, and it was too smooth, too perfect. When she knocked on it, it gave a hollow, drum-like sound. Curiosity overriding her frustration with the booth, she took a hammer and a crowbar from the shed. Her first blow felt like a violation, punching a hole in the smooth surface. But behind it, there was not cinder block. There was empty space. Heart-pounding, she worked with a feverish intensity, tearing away chunks of drywall and insulation. Behind the false wall was a small, hidden pantry. It was not a treasure chamber. It was something more mundane, and yet more mysterious. The shelves were neatly stacked with canned goods, beans, soup, preserved peaches, their labels faded but still legible. There were thick woolen blankets folded in a waterproof container, a first aid kit, water purification tablets. It was a survival cache, a fallout shelter for a forgotten war. Why? Why would her father, a man who could barely afford to patch the screen, build a secret, stocked pantry inside his failing business? It made no sense. She sat down on the dusty floor, the scent of plaster and old food filling her nostrils. She thought of Sam's words. He said people needed a place to go. This wasn't for a nuclear winter. This was for a human one. This was for the people who showed up hungry. The people her father couldn't afford to feed from the cash register, but fed anyway from this hidden larder. The discovery shifted something in her. She was no longer just cleaning up a ruin. She was excavating a life. A life lived in secret. A life of quiet, hidden charity. The projection booth was no longer just a locked room. It was the next chapter. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat in her car, parked in the middle of the lot, the drive-in a landscape of hulking shadows under a sliver of moon. Flicker was asleep on the passenger seat, his breathing a soft, rhythmic puff. She thought about Richard's world of transparent, gleaming surfaces, of deals made in brightly lit rooms where every asset was accounted for and every motive was clear. Profit, greed, ambition. Her father's world, she was realizing, had been the opposite. It was a world of shadows, of hidden spaces, of actions taken for reasons that could never be entered on a balance sheet. The next morning, she returned to the projection booth with a new resolve. She wasn't going to break the lock. She was going to undo it. She sat on the metal landing, studying the door as if it were a text. And she saw it. A tiny scratch, almost invisible, near the bottom hinge. She ran her finger over it. It wasn't a scratch. It was a line, deliberately etched into the metal. Following it with her eye, she saw it pointed down, toward the steel plate of the landing she was sitting on. She got on her hands and knees. The landing was made of diamond plate steel, a grid of raised, non-slip bumps. But in the corner, right where the etched line pointed, one of the diamonds was not like the others. It was smoother. She pressed on it. Nothing. She pushed it. Nothing. Frustrated, she sat back, and her knee pressed down hard on the spot. She heard a faint click, a sound from inside the door jamb. She stood up, her heart hammering against her ribs. She turned the handle of the big, modern deadbolt. It didn't move. She tried the door's own original knob, the one she had assumed was long since disconnected. It turned, smooth as silk. The door swung inward with a well-oiled sigh, revealing a cavern of perfect, silent darkness. She had found the key. Not a key of metal, but of knowledge, of patience, of looking at something everyone else dismissed, and seeing the one detail that mattered. Flicker bounded up the stairs and pushed past her into the darkness, his tail wagging for the first time since she'd arrived. Eliza took a deep breath, the air from the room cool and smelling of old paper, ozone, and something else, something like time itself. She stepped across the threshold, out of the sun and into her father's secret heart. The room was not what she expected. It was not a dusty repository of broken machines. It was an archive, meticulously clean, meticulously organized. The hulking twin projectors stood in the center of the room like ancient gods, their metal surfaces gleaming, not with polish, but with a film of protective oil. But the walls were the miracle. They were lined, floor to ceiling, with custom-built shelves. And on the shelves were not canisters of old Hollywood movies. There were hundreds, perhaps thousands, of small, neatly labeled boxes. The boxes that held audio tape reels. And on a workbench, under a single bare bulb, sat a large professional-grade reel-to-reel tape recorder, a microphone, and an open ledger. The last entry was dated the week her father had died. Eliza ran her hand along a row of the tape boxes. The labels were written in her father's neat, architectural hand. Agnes Miller, The Dust Bowl Years. Henryk Nowakowski, The Shipyards. Maria Flores, The Canneries. It was not a collection of films. It was a library of voices. If you have stayed with this story this far, if you have felt the grit of the gravel under Eliza's feet and the ache in her shoulders from the weight of the scythe, stay a little longer. If you have felt the quiet shame of the beige apartment and the first, hesitant warmth of the sun on her face as she uncovered the cracked asphalt, do not turn away now. Because the part that comes next, the part that was waiting in the cool, quiet dark of the projection booth, is the part I have been waiting to tell you. It is the reason for the weeds and the rust and the silence. It is the moment when a woman who was told she was worthless finds out what is truly worth fighting for. What Eliza found on that workbench was more than a machine. It was her father's heart laid bare. It was a confession, a mission, and a legacy, all spooled onto magnetic tape. What happens next is not about revenge, but about reclamation. It's about the difference between a place and a property, between a memory and a price tag. It is the story of how the quietest voices, saved in the dark, can sometimes become the loudest noise of all. So stay, the show is about to begin. The first thing Eliza did was close the door, the click of the latch echoing in the sudden dark. She fumbled for a light switch, her fingers finding it by memory from her childhood. A single bare bulb flickered on, casting a warm, yellow glow over the room. It was exactly as she remembered it, and yet completely different. The smell was the same, the unique, metallic, and warm scent of the projectors, a smell she associated with safety and wonder. But the order, the sheer, obsessive neatness of it all, was new. Her father had been tidy, But this was something else. This was sacred. She walked to the workbench. The ledger lay open next to the tape recorder. It wasn't an accounting book for the drive-in's meager profits. The columns were headed, name, date, story, payment rendered. She ran her finger down the last page. The names were a litany of the town's forgotten footnotes. Farmhands, waitresses, mechanics, the families who had lived in the temporary housing by the old cannery. Under the payment rendered column, the entries were not in dollars and cents. They were things like, a jar of pickled beets, fixed the carburetor on my Ford, a song from the old country, a promise to check on the widow Jensen. Her father hadn't been running a business. He had been running a bank of another kind, a place where the currency was memory and the deposits were human stories. He had been trading a few hours of flickering light on a giant screen for the preservation of a life. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. She sank into the worn wooden stool by the bench, the same stool her father had sat on for countless nights. All those years, she and Richard and the whole town had thought he was a failure, a man clinging to a dead enterprise out of sentimentality. But he hadn't been clinging to the past. He had been building an ark. He was saving the stories of people being washed away by the tide of progress, the kind of progress Richard was now selling as the town's only future. The drive-in wasn't the business. It was the cover. The perfect, folksy, non-threatening cover for a radical act of cultural preservation. No one would ever suspect that the man showing 20-year-old westerns was secretly conducting the most important work in town. He was the town's unofficial historian, its confessor, its archivist. The weight of it settled on her, the responsibility. This wasn't just a collection of old tapes. It was a testament, and now it was hers. Her gaze fell on a small, locked metal box on the corner of the workbench. Unlike the main door, this had a simple, old-fashioned lock. The key was in the ledger, tucked between the last two pages, cold against the paper. Her fingers trembled as she fitted it into the lock and turned. Inside, there was no money. There was a stack of her father's personal journals, bound in cheap, spiral-bound notebooks. And on top of them, a single, sealed envelope with her name, Lizzie, written on it in his familiar script. She didn't open it. Not yet. The moment felt too heavy, the air in the room too thick with the ghosts of all those voices stacked on the shelves. Instead, she picked up the first journal. The entries were dated, starting almost 30 years ago, right around the time Richard had first started making a name for himself in the area. The first few pages were about the drive-in, repairs, film orders. Then the tone shifted. October 12th. Richard closed the deal on the old downtown block. Tore down the mercantile. Mrs. Gable cried when she told me. Her grandfather built that counter with his own hands. Said it was like tearing a page out of the town's book. I think she's right. A town is a book. And he's tearing out all the pages with no pictures. Another entry, a year later. Started recording tonight. Henryk Nowakowski. He worked at the shipyard for 40 years. They gave him a pin and a pension that won't cover his rent. He told me about the launch of the Victory ships, the whole town at the docks, the pride. No one remembers that now. They just see a rusted-out pier. I put his voice on tape. It feels real. It feels heavy. I think this is the work now. Eliza read for hours, page after page, notebook after notebook. She read about her father's growing alarm as Richard's development spread, swallowing up family farms, old neighborhoods, and the small businesses that had been the town's backbone. He documented it all, not with anger, but with a profound, aching sorrow. He saw that Richard wasn't just building things, he was erasing things. He was creating a new, shiny, amnesiac town that had no memory of what it had been. And in the margins of these stories of loss, her father detailed his secret project. He wrote about the technical challenges of recording in the booth, how he soundproofed it, how he learned to splice tape. He wrote about the people, their shyness at first, then the flood of words as they realized someone was finally listening. He was giving them the one thing Richard's money couldn't buy: permanence. It was almost dawn when she finally put the journals down. The single bulb seemed dimmer, the shadows in the room deeper. The elation of her discovery had given way to a heavy, terrifying clarity. This wasn't just her father's legacy, it was a weapon. It was a truth so potent it could unravel the carefully constructed narrative Richard had sold to the entire town. And he had just handed it to the one person he was sure had no idea what to do with it. The letter felt warm in her hands, a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. It was the last piece of her father's voice she would ever hear for the first time. She took it and the journals and walked back down the metal stairs, Flicker trailing behind her. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the underbellies of the clouds in shades of pink and orange. The light fell across the cracked asphalt of the lot, illuminating the patches she had so carefully weeded and swept. It looked tended. It looked like a place that was cared for. She sat in the driver's seat of her old car, the engine cold, and with trembling fingers, she broke the seal on the envelope. The letter was written on a single sheet of yellow legal paper, the kind her father always used for his notes. The handwriting was a little shaky, dated just a month before his final heart attack. "My dearest Lizzie," it began, and the simple, familiar name undid her. A tear splashed onto the paper, smudging the ink. She wiped her eyes and continued, "If you are reading this, it means you found the key. I'm not surprised. You always were the one who noticed things. You have your mother's eyes, but you have my way of seeing. You see the details others miss. I imagine you have a lot of questions. I'm sorry I'm not there to answer them. I'm sorry for a lot of things. I'm sorry I let you think this place was a failure. In a way, I needed you to. I needed everyone to. It was the only way to protect the work. I saw what was happening to our town, Lizzie. I saw the stories getting paved over. A place isn't just the buildings. It's the stories people tell about it. When you erase the stories, you erase the soul of the place. The man you married, he's very good at erasing things. He calls it progress. I call it theft. I couldn't stop him. I didn't have his money or his power. But I could do one thing. I could listen. I could record. I could make a safe place for the stories that were being evicted along with the people. This drive-in, this silly, broken-down old drive-in, became my ark. The price of admission was a story. It was the best bargain I ever made. I don't know what you will do with this knowledge. That is not for me to say. This collection is a heavy thing to hold. It's a history, and it's a burden. But it is also a choice. You can let it gather dust, and no one would blame you. Or you can find a way to let these voices be heard again. Whatever you do, know this. I was always proud of you. Even when we were far apart, you were the light of my life. The dark is where you see the light best, and you, my Lizzie, were always the best and brightest light. The light is for them now, Lizzie. If you can, turn it on. All my love, Dad." She folded the letter and held it to her chest. The grief she had been holding at bay for years, the grief from his death that had been complicated by her life with Richard, finally broke through. She wept, not with the dry, empty sobs of the beige apartment, but with a storm of sorrow and love and a profound, heartbreaking gratitude. He had seen her. All this time, he had truly seen her. The sun was higher now, its rays slanting through the dusty windshield. She looked at the letter, then at the journals on the seat beside her, then out at the empty field of speaker poles, standing like a silent army at attention. Her father had given her a choice. Let it gather dust, or turn on the light. A few days later, a sleek black sedan crunched up the gravel lane. Richard's young lawyer, Mark, got out. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than her car, but he looked uncomfortable, the city gloss of him clashing with the homespun decay of the drive-in. He carried a leather briefcase. "Eliza," he said, his voice attempting a warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "You've been busy. The place looks different." "It is different," she said. She was standing by the concession stand, a paintbrush in her hand. She did not put it down. Mark cleared his throat, unnerved by her stillness. "Look, I'm here on behalf of Richard. He's concerned about you. He knows this place holds sentimental value, but it's a financial drain. It's a liability." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "He's prepared a generous offer to take it off your hands. Far more than it's worth, frankly. A gesture of goodwill." He slid a piece of paper toward her, an offer to purchase. The number was insultingly low, but high enough that a desperate person might take it. $10,000. For land that would complete a multi-million-dollar development. "He wants me to sign this," Eliza said. It was a statement, not a question. "He thinks it's in your best interest," Mark said, the words sounding rehearsed. "You could get a fresh start. A new apartment, maybe travel a bit. Leave all this." He gestured vaguely at the drive-in, behind. Eliza looked at the paper, then at the young man's face. She saw the flicker of shame in his eyes, the same one she'd seen in the law office. He knew this was wrong. He was just a soldier, following orders. She thought of the ledger in the projection booth. Payment rendered, a song from the old country. She thought of the journals. He's very good at erasing things. She picked up the offer. Mark's face relaxed into a small, relieved smile. He thought he had won. She held his gaze. And then, very slowly, she tore the paper in half, and then in half again, letting the pieces fall to the gravel at her feet. Mark's smile vanished. "Eliza." "Tell Richard," she said, her voice quiet but clear as a bell, "that the property is not for sale." "He won't like that," Mark warned, a hint of his boss's menace creeping into his voice. "This is a time-sensitive offer. There are other ways to acquire property. Condemnation, zoning violations." "I'm sure there are," Eliza said. She turned her back on him and dipped her brush into the can of white paint. "Tell him I'm not scared of him anymore." Mark stood there for a long moment, the torn pieces of paper at his feet. He looked at her, then at the vast, silent screen, then back at her. He shook his head, a gesture of disbelief, got back in his expensive car, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. The first shot had been fired. The stakes were no longer just sentimental, they were real. And as Eliza painted a long, clean, white stroke on the peeling wall of the concession stand, she felt a thrill of fear and excitement. The work had begun. Richard did not take the rejection well. 2 days after Mark's visit, a certified letter arrived at Eliza's small apartment. It was from the county zoning board, a notice of violation. The drive-in property was being cited for numerous code infringements: unsafe structures, fire hazards due to overgrown vegetation, public nuisance. A hearing was scheduled in 2 weeks. If the violations were not addressed, the county would have the authority to condemn the property and order its demolition. The letter was signed by the head of the zoning board, a man Eliza remembered from Richard's Christmas parties. His fingerprints were all over it. This was not just a legal maneuver, it was a threat. She was being backed into a corner. Her work at the drive-in had been cosmetic, a solitary act of love. She had cleared weeds and patched asphalt. She had not rewired the concession stand or structurally reinforced the screen tower. She had no money for that kind of work and no time. The deadline was a guillotine. Her first instinct was to panic. The familiar cold dread that had been her companion for the last year began to creep in. He was too powerful. He had all the cards. The words of her old lawyer echoed in her head. But then she thought of the journals. She thought of her father, facing down these same threats for years, quietly, stubbornly. She thought of the voices on the tapes, the stories of people who had lost everything but their dignity. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Purpose was a shield. She went to Sam's diner, the notice clutched in her hand. He read it, his face grim. "He's not wasting any time," he said, sliding a cup of coffee toward her. "This is how he works. He suffocates you with paperwork and lawyers until you give up." "I'm not giving up," Eliza said. The words came out stronger than she felt. "Good," Sam said, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "Then we've got work to do." He started making calls. He called a retired electrician, a man whose father's story was on one of those tapes. He called a roofer who owed Arthur a favor from 15 years ago. He called a woman who ran a small landscaping business, whose grandmother had been fed from the secret pantry. He didn't ask for help. He just told them what was happening. He told them Eliza was trying to save her father's place. The next Saturday morning, Eliza drove to the drive-in, expecting to face the overwhelming task alone. Instead, she found a small crowd waiting for her at the gate. The electrician, a burly man named George, was there with his tools. The roofer, Maria, had a truck loaded with shingles and tar. A half-dozen people she didn't even know were there with lawnmowers, paint rollers, and garbage bags. They were the children and grandchildren of the voices on the shelves. They were the living embodiment of her father's secret work. No one said much. There were no grand speeches. George just nodded at her and said, "Sam told us you could use a hand. Where do we start?" Eliza felt a lump form in her throat. She looked at these faces, weather-beaten and kind, and saw the town Richard had tried to erase. It wasn't gone. It had just been waiting for a reason to come together. The drive-in buzzed with a new kind of energy. It was the sound of a community waking up. The whine of a saw, the rhythmic thump of a hammer, the chatter of people working side by side. They worked all day, fueled by coffee and donuts Sam brought from the diner. They fixed the faulty wiring in the concession stand. They patched the roof. They replaced the broken windows in the projection booth. They gave the giant screen a fresh coat of brilliant white paint. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the transformed lot, they stood back to admire their work. It wasn't perfect. It was still old, still scarred. But it was safe. It was clean. It was loved. As the small crowd began to pack up their tools, a car pulled in. It was Mark, the lawyer. He got out of his car slowly, not with the arrogance of his last visit, but with a hesitant, almost fearful reluctance. He was not carrying a briefcase. He just stood there, watching the families leave, a look of profound confusion on his face. He had come expecting to see a lone, defeated woman. He had found an army. Eliza walked over to him. "Did you come to serve me more papers?" she asked, her voice tired but steady. "No," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He looked at the freshly painted screen, shining in the twilight. I don't understand. Who are all these people?" "They're the town," Eliza said simply. "The one you don't see from your office window." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not a suit, but a young man who was in over his head. "My boss, Richard, he's not going to stop," he said. "The hearing is still on. These cosmetic fixes won't be enough. He'll find another way." "I know," Eliza said. She had spent the last several nights in the projection booth, not reading, but listening. She had threaded the brittle tape onto the reels, and with her heart in her throat, pressed play. She had listened to the stories. The voices, tinny and laced with static, filled the small room, more real and powerful than any legal document. She had been looking for a defense. What she had found was a strategy. "Tell me, Mark," she said, her voice dropping, taking on a new, quiet authority. "What was your grandfather's name?" Mark looked startled. "What? Why?" "Your last name is Gable, isn't it?" she pressed. The Gables owned the big mercantile downtown for almost 100 years. Before Richard bought them out. Mark went pale. How do you know that? Your grandmother, Agnes. She had a beautiful voice. A little raspy. She told my father the whole story. About the beautiful oak counter her grandfather had built. About the day the wrecking ball came. I have it all. Right here. She tapped her temple. And up there. She nodded toward the projection booth, a dark silhouette against the last of the evening light. On tape. Mark stared at her, his mouth slightly open. The professional mask had shattered. He was just a boy hearing a ghost story about his own family. You're bluffing, he whispered, but there was no conviction in it. Am I? Eliza said. The hearing is in 10 days. You and Richard should come. I'm planning a special presentation. You might even call it a movie premiere. She turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the middle of the gravel lot, a solitary, well-dressed man lost in the encroaching darkness. The day of the town hall meeting dawned gray and overcast, the sky the color of dirty dishwater. It suited Eliza's mood. She was not nervous, she was heavy. She felt the weight of all the stories she carried, the responsibility of being their vessel. She had spent the last week in the projection booth, not just listening, but working. With Sam's help, she had found an old audio editor, a man who had once worked for the local radio station, who showed her how to clean up the sound on the old tapes, how to digitize them, how to weave them together. They had worked late into the night, fueled by coffee and a shared sense of mission. She was not bringing a legal argument to the meeting, she was bringing a choir. The meeting was to be held in the high school auditorium, the only public space large enough. When Eliza arrived, the room was already packed. She saw Richard in the front row, flanked by Mark and a team of other lawyers. He looked confident, serene, like a king holding court. He gave her a small, condescending nod, a gesture that said, "Let's get this little formality over with." The town was there too. Sam and George and Maria and all the others who had helped at the drive-in were scattered throughout the crowd. They were outnumbered by the newer residents, the people who lived in Richard's developments, who saw the drive-in as a blight and its owner as an obstacle to their property values. The hearing began. The head of the zoning board, Richard's man, laid out the case against the drive-in, his voice droning on about fire codes and structural integrity, using photographs taken before Eliza and her volunteers had done their work. He painted a picture of a dangerous, derelict property that needed to be razed for the public good. Then it was her turn. Eliza walked to the podium at the front of the room. She was not carrying a briefcase full of documents. She was carrying a single, small, digital audio player. "Good evening," she said, her voice clear and steady, amplified by the microphone. "My name is Eliza Gable. Before that, my name was Eliza Monroe. My father was Arthur Monroe. Many of you remember him. Most of you probably think of him as the man who ran the old drive-in into the ground." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Richard smirked. "You've heard a lot about codes and violations tonight. I'm not a lawyer or an engineer. I can't speak to you in that language. But my father taught me that a place is more than just a building. It's a collection of stories. And for the last 30 years, his drive-in wasn't just showing movies. It was collecting stories." She held up the audio player. "I'd like to play you something. It's not very long. I call it the sound of progress." She pressed play. The first voice that filled the auditorium was tinny, laced with the hiss of old tape, but heartbreakingly clear. It was an old man's voice, rough with emotion. "And he built that counter with his own hands, from a single oak tree on our farm. You could see the whole history of the town in the nicks and scratches on that wood. The day they tore it down, it was like they were tearing down my grandfather." A photo flashed onto the large screen behind the stage, a photo Eliza had found in her father's archives. It showed the old Gable Mercantile, a proud brick building on a bustling main street. In the front row, Mark Gable went rigid. Richard shot him a furious look. The audio continued. Another voice, a woman's this time, layered over the first. "We had a farm, just north of town. My family had worked that land for 4 generations. Then the letters started coming. Offers. Then warnings. Said our farm was in the path of a new highway. A highway that was never built. We had to sell. We got pennies on the dollar. Now it's a golf course. A new photo appeared. A black and white image of a family standing proudly in front of a simple farmhouse. The voices kept coming, a cascade of them, a river of loss and memory. The shipyard worker, the cannery packer, the waitress from the diner that was replaced by a fast food chain. Each voice was accompanied by a photo from her father's collection. A face, a building, a piece of the town that was no more. Eliza didn't say a word. She just let the voices speak for themselves. The mood in the room shifted. The smug confidence on the faces of the newer residents began to curdle into confusion, then discomfort. The older residents were nodding, some wiping away tears. They were hearing their own history, a history they had been told to forget. Finally, one last voice came on. A young man, his voice full of a desperate bravado. He said it was a great opportunity, a starter investment. Convinced my dad to sink his entire retirement into this new development, Sunrise Meadows. Said it was a sure thing. Turns out the only sure thing was that the land was a swamp. My dad lost everything. He died a year later. Never got over the shame. Eliza let the silence that followed the last voice stretch for a beat. Then she spoke, her voice low and resonant. That last voice was my father. He was talking about his first business, a small diner he tried to open. The sure thing investment was Richard Gable's first solo project. The auditorium erupted. All eyes turned to Richard, whose face had gone from tan to ashen. The mask was gone. He looked small and ugly and old. But the final blow did not come from Eliza. It came from the front row. Mark Gable stood up, his body trembling. He turned not to the board, but to the crowd. "It's true," he said, his voice cracking. "The first voice you heard, that was my great-grandfather. The mercantile, it was our family's story. Richard told me it was just business." He turned to face his boss. "And the demolition order, the report on the drive-in safety, I was ordered to falsify it, to exaggerate the dangers, to ensure it would be condemned." He took a deep breath, and the next words sealed Richard's fate. "I have the emails, and I am submitting them, along with my resignation, as public record." He dropped a USB stick on the podium and walked out of the auditorium, not looking back. The meeting descended into chaos. The head of the zoning board was shouting for order, but no one was listening. The press, who had come for a boring zoning meeting, were swarming Richard, who sat frozen in his chair, a man suddenly and irrevocably erased. Eliza just stood at the podium, watching the storm she had unleashed. She felt no triumph, only a deep, quiet, and profound sense of justice. The voices had been heard, the light had been turned on. The aftermath was swift and brutal, at least for Richard. The story was on the front page of the local paper the next morning, then picked up by regional news. The emails Mark had released were damning, revealing a pattern of predatory practices and political manipulation going back decades. The Lakeside Estates project stalled, its investors pulling out. The city council, which had once courted him, opened an investigation. Richard's empire, built on a foundation of erased histories, began to crumble. He disappeared from public life, retreating into the fortress of his big, empty house. He was ruined, not in the way he had ruined others, with financial destitution, but in a way that was, for him, far worse. He had lost his good name. He had become a bad story. Eliza, however, wanted no part of the victory tour. She refused interviews, directing reporters to the town library, where she had donated copies of all her father's digitized tapes. The stories, she said, belonged to everyone. She did not want revenge. She wanted restoration. The day after the meeting, she was back at the drive-in, sweeping gravel. She was surprised when a car pulled up. It was Mark Gable. He was dressed in jeans and a t-shirt, and he looked like he hadn't slept. He got out of the car and just stood there for a moment, looking awkward. "I'm not sure why I'm here," he said, his voice hoarse. To apologize, I guess. Though I know that's not enough. No, it's not, Eliza said, not unkindly. She kept sweeping. What I helped him do to your family, to this whole town. He trailed off, shaking his head. I listened to some of the tapes at the library last night. My grandmother. I never knew she had a voice like that. He looked around at the drive-in, at the half-finished work. Can I? He gestured vaguely, helplessly. Eliza stopped sweeping. She looked at his clean, soft hands, the hands of a lawyer who pushed paper, not a wheelbarrow. She looked at his face, at the genuine shame and remorse in his eyes. She thought of her father's ledger. Payment rendered. The fence along the back line needs painting, she said, and handed him a scraper. He took it, his grip clumsy, and he began to work. He came back the next day, and the day after that. He was slow and awkward, and he got more paint on himself than on the fence, but he showed up. He was the first. The community chorus followed. Sam put a jar on the counter of the diner, labeled Drive-In Restoration Fund. It filled up overnight. George the electrician came back and organized a crew to install new, safe lighting. Maria the roofer taught Mark how to properly tar a roof seam. Families who had heard their own parents' or grandparents' voices on the tapes for the first time showed up, not just with money or tools, but with food, with stories, with old photographs. The drive-in was transformed. It became less a place of business and more a living museum, a community center without walls. They built a small stage in front of the giant screen for local musicians. They planted a community garden in the space where the last 2 rows of speaker poles had rusted away. They didn't talk about a grand reopening. The place had never been closed. It had just been sleeping. One evening, as the sun set, Eliza was sitting on the hood of her car, watching a group of teenagers plant tomatoes in the garden. Flicker, now fat and content, was dozing at her feet. Mark, his hands now calloused and stained with paint, sat beside her, nursing a bottle of water. You could make a fortune here, you know, he said quietly. Franchise this. The Story Drive-In, a model for historical preservation. I could write the business plan. Eliza smiled. A few months ago, that might have sounded like a good idea. This place isn't a business plan, Mark. It's a promise. What do you do now? He asked. You saved it. You won. It was never about winning, she said, looking out at the giant white screen gleaming in the dusk. It's about continuing. The work is never done. She had found her father's purpose, but she knew it had to become her own. Her father had collected the stories of the past, but what about the stories of the now? The world was still full of people getting paved over, of voices being silenced. The need for an arc was never ending. She had refused all of Richard's money in the final divorce settlement, which was now being renegotiated in her favor. She took only one thing, a small annuity, enough to live on, and enough to pay the property taxes on a worthless piece of land at the edge of town. She didn't want his money. She wanted his opposite. She wanted a life measured not in dollars, but in stories. The found family that had gathered around the drive-in was her real fortune. Sam, who still showed up with coffee. Mark, who was now debating law school or learning how to be a carpenter. The dozens of others who came and went, each leaving a little piece of themselves and taking a little piece of the place's quiet strength with them. The days got shorter, the nights grew cooler. The tomatoes in the garden ripened and were harvested. The drive-in settled into a new rhythm, a quiet hum of purpose. The legacy was safe, but a legacy isn't something you put on a shelf. It's something you live. Autumn painted the trees around the drive-in in hues of gold and rust. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. The work on the drive-in had slowed, the big projects completed. Now there was just the quiet, daily rhythm of maintenance, of being present. One Friday night, long after the sun had gone down, Eliza was in the projection booth, carefully cataloging a box of old photographs a woman had brought by that afternoon. The woman's father had been the projectionist before Arthur took over, and the photos were a lost chapter, a story before the story Eliza knew. Flicker was asleep under the workbench, his leg twitching as he chased dream rabbits. A pair of headlights swung into the drive-in, sweeping across the lot before the car came to a stop near the concession stand. It was an old, battered minivan, packed to the gills with boxes and bags, a mattress tied precariously to the roof. Eliza watched for a moment from the window. The car just sat there, its engine idling, a small island of light and sound in the vast, quiet dark. It was the kind of car that was not stopping for a visit, but pausing on a long, hard journey from one life to another. She thought of her father. She thought of the hidden pantry, the hot soup, the open gate. She turned off the light in the booth and went down the stairs. As she approached, a man got out of the driver's side. He was young, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond lack of sleep. A woman was in the passenger seat, and in the back, Eliza could just make out the shape of a small child asleep in a car seat. "Sorry," the man said, his voice low, as if he expected to be yelled at. We're not here to cause any trouble. We just needed a place to pull over for a bit." The sign said, "Open." Eliza looked at the old marquee by the road. After much debate, they had decided on the new lettering. It didn't list movie titles. It just said, in bright, clean letters, "The Starlight Story Sanctuary. All are welcome." "You're not causing any trouble," Eliza said, her voice gentle. "You look tired and hungry." The man just stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and suspicion. People weren't usually kind. "We don't have much money," he said, his chin jutting out defensively. "I'm not asking for money," Eliza said. She smiled, a real, warm smile. She went to the concession stand, which was now always stocked with a few simple things: coffee, soup, bread, thanks to the fund from Sam's Diner. She returned with 2 steaming mugs of soup and a bag of popcorn for the child. She handed one of the mugs to the man. His hand was trembling as he took it. "My name is Eliza," she said. "What's yours?" He told her his name, and then, slowly, haltingly, he began to tell her his story. A story of a lost job, a medical bill, an eviction. A story that was painfully common, and yet entirely his own. It was a story that would never make the papers. A story that was being erased by the day's headlines. Eliza listened. She just listened. Her head tilted, her gaze patient and kind. After a while, she went back to the concession stand and brought out one of the old, heavy metal speakers, the kind you hang on your car window. She went to the minivan and gently hooked it over the half-open window on the wife's side. The woman, who had been silent until now, looked at her, her eyes wide with a question. "What are you doing?" the husband asked. Eliza didn't answer right away. She walked back to the projection booth, the man's story settling inside her, finding its place among the others. She threaded a reel of blank tape onto the old machine. She flipped a series of switches on a panel her father had built. A warm, low hum filled the lot as the amplifiers came to life. Down below, a soft, amber light came on above the concession stand, and a gentle crackle emitted from the speaker hanging on the minivan's window. It was the sound of a place ready to listen. Eliza picked up the microphone. Her hand was steady. She looked out the window, at the small, tired family in the vast, dark lot, a tiny ship in a great ocean. And she thought of her father, and the letter, and the light. The dark is where you see the light best. She leaned toward the microphone, her voice soft, carrying not just through the speaker, but across the quiet, sleeping town. "Tell me everything," she said. "We have all the time in the world."
Not good, cat. I'm dying. Honestly, I can't. Not all y'all lurking and then just like showing up because y'all heard fighting words. me it's also 4 a.m. for you. It is, well, I don't know. Are you rounding up, Leo? Because it's like 3:38 for me. It's for war words, not the war words. Maybe, maybe let's not use the W word in Esta Economia right now. It's 4:38. Oh, you're in Eastern. Not the don't point at me. I'm dying. It's 4 here, but don't worry, I'm in my night shift. Oh, nice. Well, hopefully, work's going pretty well, Leo. This is what we all look like, truly. Wait, chat was so calm, and then all of a sudden everybody came out. By the way, Dino, I tried your method of eating Oreos. What did you think, Lynn? What if Rich isn't even real and Dino was just testing our loyalty? I would never. Wait, what's the Oreo method? Oh my god, hi, Riss. Honestly, it's not that bad. I might eat them like that again. Thank you. So the method, Riss, is you take a cup, fill it with like ice cold milk or soy milk, whatever you want, right? And then you put like 4 to 5 Oreos into it and grab a spoon and then you eat it out of the cup. I age a decade every time Dino describes this. I'm so sorry. How many of these do we need? Wait, did I miss the second food quirk you promised us? No, you did not miss it. I haven't told you guys what the second food quirk is. I'm back. My father called me for the funeral. Oh, welcome back, Manuela. You just missed a miniature riot. I really can't judge because I eat pickles with hot Cheetos. That sounds great, Nelly. We need to make 2 more. Sorry to make you explain again. Don't apologize to me, Iris. Apologize to Hard Eyes on the Purple app. I have no shame in the way that I eat Oreos. I've done it for years and I will continue to do it. What am I missing? God, we need concrete? Jesus.